My parents stole my entire savings to pay my sister's wedding bills while ignoring my struggles, so I walked away quietly, and what followed destroyed their perfect image forever. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and growing up, I was always the responsible one. My younger sister, Lily, was the golden child, charming, beautiful, and effortlessly adored by everyone, especially our parents. From the moment she could walk, it felt like the world revolved around her. Birthdays, achievements, even small victories were celebrated with fanfare, while I quietly handled the background, the bills, the chores, the constant emotional balancing act nobody acknowledged. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after school, scribbling out math homework while my parents fussed over Lily's recital, telling her, "You're so talented, just like your mother." The praise stung, not because she didn't deserve it, but because the same eyes never lingered on me the way they did on her. By the time I hit my teens, I was paying my own tuition, picking up extra shifts at local jobs, and making sure the house ran smoothly when my parents were too busy doting on Lily to notice the small disasters I quietly prevented. I learned to anticipate problems before anyone else saw them. I learned to swallow complaints and wear patience like armor. Friends occasionally noticed the imbalance. "Man, your family leans on you a lot," they'd say, and I'd nod with a tight smile, pretending it was normal, pretending loyalty meant enduring quietly. I internalized responsibility as a point of pride. I told myself that if I kept being dependable, eventually my sacrifices would earn acknowledgement, respect, maybe even gratitude. I believed staying strong, quiet, and useful would protect me from being overlooked or abandoned. Most nights, I lay in bed listening to the faint echoes of laughter from Lily's room, thinking that if I just stayed reliable enough, I could somehow keep the fragile balance of our family intact. I was convinced that my life's work was invisible but essential, and that one day, someone would notice. But deep down, a small, nagging part of me wondered if anyone ever would. By the time I turned 20, I had built a small financial cushion from part-time jobs, overtime, and odd gigs, quietly thinking it was my safety net. I never bragged about it. Money was something you handled responsibly, not something you flaunted. Meanwhile, Lily seemed to float through life without a care, asking for little but receiving everything. Birthday presents, concert tickets, even the newest phone, my parents never questioned it. I remember one evening, bringing home my latest paycheck from a grueling double shift, and Lily barged into the living room holding a designer bag she'd been hinting at for weeks. "Look, I finally got it," she said, eyes sparkling. My parents beamed, fawning over her excitement while I tucked my envelope of cash into my wallet, unnoticed. I kept my feelings in check because that was expected of me. Responsibility was my identity, resentment had no place in the equation. Still, there was a sting every time my parents overlooked my efforts. I recall helping Mom sort through bills one night, only to have her sigh and say, "You're so reliable, I don't know what we'd do without you," before rushing to Lily's room to fuss over her latest school project. The contrast was brutal. I was the backbone, the fixer, the invisible safety net, while Lily's world sparkled effortlessly around her. Friends occasionally commented on the imbalance. "It's like you're invisible in your own house," one of them said over coffee once, and I laughed awkwardly. Laughing was easier than admitting the frustration that gnawed at me. Still, I told myself this was normal. Enduring quietly was part of my duty, part of proving I was strong, capable, and dependable. I believed that one day, if I stayed steadfast, my loyalty would be recognized, maybe even appreciated. But deep inside, I began to feel the first cracks forming, a quiet doubt whispering that no matter how dependable I was, some sacrifices might never be noticed, or returned. When my parents announced Lily's engagement, I felt a mix of excitement and unease I couldn't shake. Weddings were supposed to be joyful, right? But the moment they started talking about costs, my stomach sank. "We'll need everyone to contribute," Mom said casually, like it was a given. Dad nodded, adding, "You know how important it is to make this perfect for Lily." Perfect. That word hit me like a punch, because perfect for Lily had always come at someone else's expense. I realized, in a quiet, sinking moment, that my contributions were expected without question. I remember sitting at my desk later that night, counting my savings for the 100th time, realizing I had enough to cover my own life comfortably, maybe even invest in a small apartment someday. And yet, I knew my parents would treat those funds as theirs to redirect toward Lily's wedding extravagance. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself that helping my sister was part of family, part of my role as the responsible one. But a knot of frustration started to tighten in my chest, the familiar voice of self-doubt whispering, "Are you ever enough for them?" Even friends who had watched me quietly sacrifice over the years sensed my tension. "Man, they're always leaning on you, aren't they?" one said after a late-night coffee. I forced a smile, laughed it off, but inside I was bracing myself for what I knew was coming. The imbalance that had haunted me for years was about to hit its sharpest peak yet. I went to bed that night staring at my ceiling, feeling the weight of every unpaid bill, every sleepless night, every favor done without recognition, knowing that my hard-earned savings might soon vanish, and there was nothing I could say to stop it. A week later, I realized my fears weren't unfounded. My parents called me into the living room with that same calm, practiced tone they always used when delivering family news. "We've decided to use your savings for Lily's wedding," Dad said, like he was announcing the weather. My chest tightened, my hands went clammy, and I felt a hollow sinking in my stomach. I tried to speak, to protest, but my words felt weak and pointless. Mom added, "We know it's a lot to ask, but it's for your sister, you'll understand someday." I stood there silently, heart pounding, listening to them discuss seat arrangements, catering costs, and dresses as if my sacrifice was a natural given. The room smelled faintly of Lily's perfume from her visit earlier, and the scent made the betrayal sting even more. Every coin I had worked for, every hour spent grinding jobs to build my safety net, was now being redirected without my consent. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make them see the toll their expectations had taken on me, but I stayed still, because staying calm was what I'd been trained to do. Friends and co-workers noticed my growing exhaustion, but no one could see the silent humiliation I felt at home. I paid my rent, groceries, and bills, scraping together what little I had left, while my parents celebrated Lily's planning like nothing had changed. At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every favor, every sacrifice that had led me here. The invisible ledger of my loyalty had been cashed in, and the debt I had accumulated was gone. A part of me wanted to confront them, to demand respect, but another part whispered quietly that perhaps I had learned too well, the responsible one never complains. Instead, I began to feel something dangerous, quiet anger, simmering just beneath the surface, growing with every mention of the wedding. And in that silence, I realized this was no longer just about Lily's wedding. A few days later, I stumbled onto something I never expected. While helping Dad organize old family paperwork, something I'd done countless times without complaint, I found a stack of receipts and loan documents. My heart sank as I realized my parents hadn't just used my savings, they had borrowed additional money from friends and relatives without telling Lily, framing it as, for her happiness. It was a shock that hit harder than any betrayal before. Everything I had silently assumed, that they cared about family, that Lily's wedding was about her happiness, was a lie. It was never about Lily. It was about maintaining appearances, keeping up this flawless, enviable image to the world, even at my expense. I confronted them quietly that evening, trying to keep my voice calm. "Why didn't you tell me? Why borrow from other people and spend my money without even asking?" I asked. Dad shrugged, barely looking up, and said, "We're adults. You know how weddings are, things get complicated." Mom added, almost casually, "You'll understand someday. It's for family." Their nonchalance felt like a slap to the face. My anger flared, but it was laced with disbelief. I had been blindsided, not just by their actions, but by the sheer manipulation behind it. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the truth. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment I thought I was doing the right thing had been twisted into fuel for their image. The realization was terrifying and infuriating. The foundation I had built my life on, the belief that loyalty, sacrifice, and responsibility were recognized and valued, was gone. For the first time, I understood the depth of their obsession. It wasn't about family or love, it was about control, appearances, and using me as an invisible cash machine. And in that moment, a quiet, dangerous thought began to take root: if they thought I would continue to endure, they had another thing coming. The next few weeks were brutal. I was broke, emotionally drained, and completely invisible in the family I had once trusted. Every morning I dragged myself out of bed, counting pennies to cover rent, groceries, and bills, while my parents planned yet another extravagant detail for Lily's wedding. The sound of their laughter echoing from the living room, discussing flowers, invitations, and the perfect seating arrangement, was like a constant reminder that my sacrifice didn't matter. I felt humiliated, erased, and utterly powerless. Friends reached out, worried about my exhaustion, but I forced a smile, hiding the humiliation that gnawed at me inside. One evening, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at an empty bank account and the stack of bills on the counter. I couldn't stop replaying all the times I had quietly carried the family, all the times I had swallowed frustration to maintain peace. "This isn't fair," I whispered to myself, voice barely audible over the hum of the fridge. "I've given everything, and nobody even notices. Nobody cares." The loneliness was suffocating, and for the first time in years, I felt the crushing weight of hopelessness. I wondered if I'd ever be recognized, or if my life would always be one of quiet suffering. I thought about confronting them directly, screaming, demanding respect, but even the idea felt exhausting. My body ached from stress, my mind clouded with anger and despair. For the first time, I truly understood what it meant to hit rock bottom, stripped of financial security, emotionally depleted, and utterly invisible. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, anger and clarity began to stir. I realized that endurance alone hadn't protected me, and blind loyalty hadn't earned me acknowledgement. Something had to change, something had to break, but what, exactly, I didn't yet know. The night ended with me staring out the window, city lights blurring with tears, thinking that my life as I knew it was over, and what came next would be entirely on my terms. After hitting that low point, I decided something had to change. I stopped volunteering every extra penny, stopped jumping to fix problems that weren't mine, and most importantly, I stopped asking for recognition. My parents noticed immediately. "Why aren't you helping with the wedding planning like before?" Mom asked one evening, her tone sharp with surprise. I looked her in the eye and said nothing. Silence had become my shield. I started setting boundaries quietly. I declined calls about minor errands, ignored passive-aggressive hints about covering extra expenses, and withdrew from the emotional labor I had always shouldered. It felt strange, almost rebellious, to prioritize myself after years of being invisible. The first few days were tense. Mom's sighs and Dad's murmured comments about disappointing me were like background noise I refused to absorb. Every time I resisted, a small part of me felt lighter. Friends began noticing a change too. "You seem different. Stronger," one said, over coffee, and I gave a small, knowing smile. I didn't need to explain, the satisfaction came from reclaiming control quietly, without drama. Lily, oblivious as always, continued her wedding plans, expecting the usual support, and my parents fumed quietly at my newfound detachment. The relief of self-preservation was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency. No more invisible labor, no more sacrifices without acknowledgement. I was reclaiming my life, quietly but deliberately. And as I watched them scramble to adjust to my withdrawal, I realized something crucial: the longer I stayed calm, the more their perfectly constructed image would begin to wobble without me. I went to bed that night with a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Something had shifted in me. Something was coming, something that would make them realize, finally, that the responsible one wasn't theirs to exploit forever. I began rebuilding my life quietly, almost invisibly. With all the money I still had trickling in from small side gigs, freelance work, and a few overtime shifts, I started saving again, carefully this time. Every coin I set aside felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen. I rented a tiny apartment, far enough from my parents' house to feel independent, yet close enough to keep tabs without confrontation. The smell of fresh paint and new furniture made me feel grounded, like this space was finally mine. Nights were still quiet, and I often lay awake listening to the hum of the city, letting the satisfaction of small victories sink in. My parents, meanwhile, continued with their wedding plans, oblivious to the fact that I was slowly untangling myself from their control. Friends noticed the difference in me, commenting on my confidence and how I seemed more centered. I smiled, letting them think it was natural growth, when in reality, it was quiet strategy. Lily kept asking for favors, assuming I'd respond as always, and each polite refusal strengthened my sense of autonomy. I learned the power of doing nothing, of staying calm, letting them stew in their own expectations. Even the simplest routines became empowering. Cooking my own meals, paying my own bills, choosing where to spend my time, it all felt like reclaiming freedom I had never truly known. I was no longer the invisible backbone. My parents' obsession with appearances started to show cracks, their so-called perfect family image subtly faltering without my constant support. And every evening, I reminded myself that patience, silence, and independence were more potent than confrontation. But as the wedding day loomed closer, I could sense that the storm I'd been quietly preparing for was near. Something had shifted permanently, and I knew that when the time came, the fallout would be undeniable. By this point, I had regained a quiet sense of control, and I started using it strategically. I began investing in small side projects, saving aggressively, and building a reputation for independence among friends and colleagues. Every time my parents or Lily bragged about their flawless family image, I smiled inwardly, knowing the cracks were invisible to them but obvious to others. I started sharing financial advice and resources with friends, subtly highlighting smart independence without ever revealing my family drama. Watching people respond, nodding, asking questions, praising my guidance, it felt like silent revenge, a validation I had been denied for years. At family gatherings, I kept my calm demeanor while my parents continued to flaunt the perfect wedding narrative. I noticed subtle whispers from relatives, questioning the lavish spending and wondering why I wasn't as involved as usual. Lily, oblivious, kept calling me for favors, and each polite refusal served as a reminder of the independence I had clawed back. My absence of compliance was speaking louder than any confrontation ever could. The family's image, once untouchable, was starting to wobble quietly under the weight of my withdrawal. I recall one evening, overhearing a cousin say, "It's strange how he's always been so responsible, yet he's barely involved in all this. Something doesn't add up." The satisfaction of seeing the illusion of perfection falter without me was intense. I realized that the groundwork I had laid, the silent rebuilding, the boundaries, the quiet empowerment, was slowly dismantling their control and forcing outsiders to notice the imbalance. And yet, I didn't rush it. Patience was part of the plan. I knew that when the time came for the final reveal, the impact would be devastating, a full reckoning for years of betrayal and exploitation. But for now, the tension simmered quietly, a storm just below the surface, waiting for the right moment. The day of Lily's wedding arrived, and with it, a sense of calm purpose I hadn't felt in years. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but to feel grounded, invisible yet observant. The ceremony was beautiful, over the top, exactly the way my parents had dreamed, but I noticed things others didn't, the subtle strain on my parents' faces, the whispered criticisms from extended family, and the slight tension in Lily's normally carefree demeanor. Every time my parents beamed, talking to friends about how perfect the wedding was, I felt a quiet thrill. They had built this perfect image for years, and now, without any dramatic confrontation, it was already starting to crack. During the reception, I found myself sitting at a corner table, watching. I overheard conversations that I had carefully nudged into motion over the past months, friends and relatives discussing the imbalance in our family, questioning how the wedding was funded, noticing that the responsible one had quietly removed himself from endless obligations. I stayed calm, sipping my drink, letting the subtle murmur spread. Lily's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She sensed it, though she didn't yet understand. At one point, I quietly approached a group of family friends. It's amazing, isn't it? How much responsibility one person can carry quietly without anyone realizing. I asked softly. They looked at me, intrigued, nodding, asking questions. Slowly, the pieces fell into place, the whispered doubts, the raised eyebrows, the sense that the picture-perfect family wasn't so perfect after all. The thrill wasn't in confrontation, it was in watching the carefully constructed image crumble quietly, organically, under the weight of truth. My parents' control, their manipulation, their obsession with appearances, it was all unraveling, and there was nothing they could do. I sat back, smiling faintly, knowing this was only the beginning. The storm I had been quietly preparing for was finally stirring. By the time the wedding speeches began, the atmosphere had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Relatives who had once praised my parents' perfect family now exchanged glances, murmuring quietly. I knew the moment had come. I stood, clearing my throat, and all eyes slowly turned to me. I've stayed silent for years, thinking that loyalty and responsibility were enough, I began, my voice calm but firm. But it turns out, staying quiet only let my sacrifices disappear without anyone noticing. I recounted the truth, carefully, deliberately, without anger, how my savings had been taken, how my efforts had been ignored, how my parents had borrowed and manipulated behind the scenes. The room grew tense, the chatter stopped. I saw the flush of shock on their faces, Mom's tight lips, Dad's shifting gaze. Lily's hand went to her mouth, eyes wide, the first flicker of guilt crossing her expression. For years, I carried this family silently, I continued. And for years, I was invisible. But invisible ends today. Voices began to rise around the room, relatives questioning, whispering confirmations, expressing disbelief. My parents tried to explain, to justify, but every excuse sounded hollow, rehearsed. I didn't yell, I didn't demand, they were unraveling on their own. The power shift was clear, my calm, deliberate honesty had done more damage than confrontation ever could. Lily finally spoke, her voice trembling. I didn't know it was this bad, she said, and I nodded, letting her realize the truth herself. I felt a surge of relief and validation wash over me. Years of invisible labor, quiet sacrifice, and ignored boundaries had finally forced acknowledgement. And while the fallout would continue long after the wedding ended, in that moment, the family's perfect image was permanently tarnished, and I had reclaimed my power. I sat back, letting the tension linger, knowing that the real consequences were just beginning, and that the silent justice I had built was far more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. The days after the wedding were surreal. Relatives who had once fawned over my parents began asking questions, comparing stories, noticing discrepancies they had never seen before. The whispers were subtle at first, then louder, until the facade of the perfect family began to crumble. My parents, once untouchable in their authority and image, found themselves facing judgment, curiosity, and quiet criticism from everyone around them. I watched from a distance, quietly satisfied, knowing that years of manipulation, favoritism, and exploitation were finally being acknowledged, not by me alone, but by the world they had tried to impress. I rebuilt my life intentionally, piece by piece. I found a better apartment, strengthened my financial independence, and focused on work and small personal victories. Each time I paid a bill, saved a little more, or took time for myself, it felt like reclaiming what had been stolen. Lily and I began to rebuild our relationship cautiously, on honesty instead of entitlement. She finally saw, without my explaining, how much I had carried for the family. The shift in power, clarity, and boundaries allowed us to connect on a different, healthier level. The greatest satisfaction wasn't revenge, it was empowerment. For the first time, I felt truly seen, respected, and in control of my own life. My parents' obsession with appearances, their insistence that loyalty and sacrifice could be taken for granted, had backfired spectacularly. I had endured, I had withdrawn, I had rebuilt silently, and in doing so, I had forced the truth into the open, reshaping the family dynamic forever. Sitting in my quiet apartment one evening, watching the city lights flicker through the window, I realized I had finally achieved something no one could take away: peace, independence, and the knowledge that I didn't need anyone's validation to be enough. I had walked away quietly, but the consequences of my absence had been louder than any shout could ever be. And in that calm, I smiled, knowing that the life I had quietly fought for was finally mine, and no one could ever touch it again.